Massachusetts Bay. In 1630, when the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay, 900 strong, they came better equipped and better organized than either the Virginians or the Pilgrims had been. Their leaders were prosperous farmers, and they were socially, economically, and intellectually a cut above Plymouth settlers. Not that all of the large vanguard that landed at Salem were of this class, of course, or even were all Puritans, but the leaders were. They had the Bible under one arm and their royal charter under the other. The Bible was always in evidence, but the charter was kept so carefully concealed that in time some people began to think it was a myth. It wasn't. The English authorities didn't expect the Puritans to bring their charter with them. The correct thing to do was to leave it in London and to submit meekly to government from there. John Winthrop and John Endicott were of tougher fiber than that. They did their own governing on the spot. These people, too, had need of quick shelter, but they didn't go underground. They built copies of the Indians' lodges, adding chimneys instead of putting up with smoke holes. The chimneys, built of sticks and clay, were neither durable nor safe and frequently caught fire. The lodges were not at all like the collapsible leather teepees of the western natives, who were constantly moving to follow the buffalo herds. These were more permanent, rectangular houses with arched roofs. The frames were made of poles lashed together with vines. The covering was bark or woven matting, not overwarm houses for the Massachusetts climate, but they served temporarily. In spite of the care with which the Puritan migration was managed, a care which provided even clothing, the influx of settlers outran supplies. Within a year, 2,000 people arrived, and some went on pretty short rations. They were never in as bad shape as the settlers at Plymouth had been, but were it not for the clam and some stuff bought from the Indians, many would have starved. Maryland. Of all the colonies, excepting possibly William Penn's nearly 50 years later, Lord Baltimore's was the most intelligently conceived and the best prepared. The Maryland Indians were a poor lot. They lived largely on fish, and every time they accumulated a few skins and arrowheads, their big northern neighbors, the Susquehannocks, ambled down the shore and took everything away from them. When the settlers found them, they had already decided to move west. Governor Leonard Calvert palavered with the chiefs while his settlers were still on their 2 ships in the Potomac. As a result, an arrangement was made by which the colony shared an Indian village, where St. Mary's was later built, and had no hardships whatever. They were so comfortable with the Indians that Thomas Cornwallis built a water mill before he built himself a house. New Sweden. It was on the lower Delaware, and it was a beachhead and little more, but it left its mark on the country. Peter Minuit, a Dutchman who had been the first governor of New Netherland and who made the famous purchase of Manhattan Island, brought in 100 Swedes and Finns on 2 ships in 1638. He bought both sides of the Delaware from sea to sea from the Indians for a couple of rounds of drinks and a handful of junk jewelry. The Swedes built Fort Christina where Wilmington is now, and began to set up the kind of cabins they were used to in their own country. These could be thrown up very quickly. They were built of rough logs, with the bark still on. Both ends of each log were deeply notched on both sides, and the logs were stacked, side walls and end walls alternately, with the notches resting on each other and the ends of the logs protruding both ways at the corners of the house. The rather narrow cracks left between the logs were chinked with chips and a mixture of clay and moss. No vertical posts were needed except at the door and the windows, if there were any windows. A stone fireplace was built at one end with a stone chimney, or sometimes one of logs and clay. A man with only an axe for tools and with no hardware could build such a cabin complete. It could be covered with a thatch or bark roof on lashed poles. This was the best possible pioneer house. Its material stood in the front yard and needed to be removed anyway, but it was more than 60 years later that the German settlers in Pennsylvania, having seen these cabins on the way in, began to copy them and pass them on to the Scotch-Irish frontiersmen who made them their own. The Swedish colony had no support from home, and Peter Stuyvesant was able to march in and take it over without firing a shot. The Swedes gradually merged with the English who settled in around them. In 2 generations, the children were speaking English, and many of the family names were anglicized. John Morton, who cast the deciding vote for the Declaration of Independence, was descended from a Swedish settler named Mortensen. Having spotted the first immigrants about the continent, in the following pages we will look at their way of life as they dug in, as the settlements became towns and the wilderness farms. There are good histories which deal with wars, taxes, and government. Here the concern will be with people, their food, clothes, houses, their tools and furniture, their amusements, and some of their troubles. Swedish log cabin along the Delaware River. The inset shows how the logs were notched.